Hello and most welcome to H831. We are presently filming a little bit more in the countryside, and it's a very nice and clement day here. Sunshine all over the view. Well, it's a good day as any to continue speculation about speculation. And we have now come to the philosopher Werner Marx, who has shown that absolute reflection achieves its essence only in such a speculative exposition of the speculative content. He writes following: within the presentation of the whole as truth, a singular proposition is something fixed and positively dead, hence something wrong. The simple proposition can at best denote a fixed result in the portrayal of life of truth and completing itself as a whole. The proposition in its particularity is sublated. The single proposition becomes a link in a chain of propositions. The propositions are linked together as presupposing and as positing. Therein lies the sole possibility of showing how the totality of determination is fused into true association. The speculative presentation must take command of an entire system of propositions. Well, think about this positively dead. That's the normal system of truth we have. There we only have two positions. One is truth for T and F is for false. That is a dead system for telling the truth. That's a fixed system. It's fixed in advance. It's fixed in the way that Socrates in his dialogue speaks with Timaeus and shows that the truth has always been out there. Always already out there. So that's a fixed relation, and it doesn't do any good service to furthering the truth. It makes truth strand, not go any further. It is like a boat that has been shipwrecked. It do not move. Fixed in advance and unmovable. That's the fixation of the determination of the determination. The passage from the structure of the single speculative proposition to the texture and totality of sentences marks the transition from speculation, and we pass into dialectics. While the young Hegel used speculation and dialectics synonymously, in his later work he distinguished between these concepts. Dialectics, in the preface to Phenomenology, signifies the mode of exposition of the speculative content. With dialectics, speculations turn from a purely inward revolution into an active demonstration of its content. Yet, since the dialectical exposition of the speculative in a system of proposition empties these propositions of everything that is not the notion or the concept, or anything that the notion does not comprehend, the passage to dialectics does not correspond to a simple exteriorization of speculation in the medium of language. I think this is very pertinent in this special situation. Language is used in dialectical exposition of speculative thought only to the extent that the proper meaning of the words is entirely superseded by categories, which themselves form a logical totality, and in which they appear only as moments of the self-determining notion or concept. So we have here the problem with the notion or the concept as being self-determining. And I would say that's a wide problem, something that needs to be looked upon and seen for what it is. It is widely problematic, I'd say. Although the dialectical mediation of the speculative takes place only in thought, its altered state. Thought is the altered state of speculation. Language represents an essential moment in the completion of the totality of the concept. Language thus becomes the privileged medium by which the concept can acquire the total transparency. The absolute intelligibility that characterizes it as the totality of the reflective moments of the process of its own becoming. Despite the difference between the hermeneutic and the Hegelian concept of language, it is important to stress the essential link of language to both speculation and absolute reflection. In Hegelian and hermeneutic philosophy, language plays a fundamental role in establishing the speculative totality or opening, as it is called today, within which philosophical reflection, be it empirical or transcendental, must be situated. In Hegelian and hermeneutic philosophy, language plays a fundamental role in establishing the speculative totality or opening. This opening is almost the same as Lichtung, Karlhygge, as it is called today, within which philosophical reflection, be it empirical or transcendental, must be situated. That is shown to be at once possible and limited in scope, while that is at the very same time. This exposition of the speculative totality as the resolution of reflective oppositions can be taken one step further, as a useful starting point is Ricoeur's account on what makes the speculative discourse possible, and of what it is to achieve. Ricoeur writes in The Rule of Metaphor, speculative discourse is possible because language possesses the reflective capacity to place itself at a distance, and to consider itself as such and in its entirety as related to the totality of what is. Language designates itself and its other. This reflective character extends what linguists call meta-linguistic functioning. This reflective character extends what linguists call meta-linguistic functioning, but articulates it in another discourse, speculative discourse. It is then no longer a function that can be opposed to other functions, in particular to the referential function, for it is the knowledge that accompanies the reflective function itself, the knowledge of its being related to being. From Hegelian perspective, Ricoeur's definition of speculation could easily be considered Kantian. One reason for this is that Ricoeur understands the speculative discourse itself as a discourse about language, about language discernible and multiple functions, as a discourse that thematizes and extends the metalinguistic function that accompanies the function of reference. According to Ricoeur, each of these functions can be clearly and absolutely distinguished from each other. Although Ricoeur stresses that language reflective character when articulated in speculative discourse as language consciousness of its openness to what is, can no longer be opposed to the linguistic functions, and that it is incommensurable with such functions. He seems to reduce the reflective character of language to a formal synthesis similar to the Kantian "I think", which must accompany not so much as all one's representations as all one's linguistic acts. If Ricoeur escapes such criticism, it is because he also views language as a totality comparable to the Hegelian absolute, which encompasses through sublation the two distinct linguistic functions of the metalinguistic and the referential. But if it is so, Ricoeur would have to expound speculatively the ways in which the two functions within language are superseded by the totality of language itself. In any event, Ricoeur's discussion allows us to determine more clearly what Hegel achieves with absolute reflection. In order to be all-encompassing, the speculative discourse cannot be about functions of language. If the speculative discourse is restricted to the articulations of these functions, it remains, in Hegelian terms, opposed to language. Therefore, Hegelian speculative knowledge demonstrates the identity of self-cognition and the cognition of the world of objects. The identity of these two positions occurs at the moment when exterior reflection, or the reflection of objects, recognizes that it must presuppose itself as self-reflection, and that the immediate object of its reflection is merely the reflection of that which grounds exterior reflection. Through this gesture of thought, speculative or absolute reflection succeeds in reuniting both the dogmatic or naively empirical mode of thinking characteristic of empiricism, which consists of identifying absolutely a content prior to its formal reflection, and the critical attitude presented by Kant's transcendental philosophy, in which thought knows itself to be in the position of a content for itself. Jean Hippolyte makes this clear when he writes that speculative knowledge implies the synthesis of the dogmatic attitude and the critical attitude as presented in Kant's transcendental philosophy. The intentionality of consciousness, which is turned toward pre-existing being, which relegates reflection to its subjectivity, and transcendental reflection, which reflects the self of knowing by relegating being to the thing in itself, must be confounded in speculative knowing, which is self-knowledge in the content. Of the content as self, and for which the twisting of the soul, which in looking at being looks at itself and vice versa, is itself expressed in a new logic. In empirical consciousness, intuition posits subject and object by opposing them absolutely to one another. The term and what is being termed are completely differentiated. This is the absolute division of mirror image and what is mirrored. For this reason, intuition is, as Hegel states in The Difference, empirical, given, and, this is very important, non-conscious. There can be no consciousness where subject and object is completely divided. So empirical knowledge is non-conscious, or at least strives to be completely non-conscious. I would say it is non-conscious. Whereas transcendental intuition, by contrast, enters consciousness through abstraction from the whole manifold of empirical consciousness, and in this respect it is something subjective. So the subjective is a sine qua non, an absolute prerequisite for having a conscious experience or a conscious reflection. That is absolute reflection. Whereas empirical reflection, and this is fantastic because it shows exactly how come is it possible that consciousness today almost has disappeared. Yeah, one of the reasons is, of course, that empirical knowledge do not use consciousness, or to a very little degree. It obliterates what consciousness is. It can also be explained rather bluntly and crudely, and this is not 100% correct, but if you want to have a complete equalization between object and subject, it doesn't leave any subjectivity or alteration. But that's not exactly what it is about. The absolute speculation or reflection take the whole into consideration, and that is never ever possible with empirical knowledge. It is not. It's always partitioned. So instead of saying that there is no consciousness at all, zero, you can say that it is a fragmented consciousness, and that gives the feeling of a consciousness that is being almost automatic, without a volition going on. So the mirror image, or the idea of the mirror, helps to make it understandable why it is that the reflective mode that we sort of accepted as the only possibility of knowing makes consciousness not impossible, but very, very hard to reach. And when you reach it, it is fragmented in all pieces, because it's not whole. It's an interesting view of this, what we mentioned before, as forehanden. Forehanden, yes, that's one thing, but it's also a separation from the whole. And to have any understanding that is conscious, the whole must be into consideration. It doesn't make much sense to talk about a perception of a singular thing that is conscious, because the mere singularity in itself pinpoints or directs everything into a non-conscious mood, an automatic mood, and it's presupposed. It only vouches for two alternatives, and these two only alternatives is a construction of no choice. It's what I did in my youth. I was playing the games of Kasparov's to learn, and that is still living in a way, even though every move of the pawn, the queen, and the king was presetted. There is still some living thing in it. But this particular and sharply divided doesn't have the living sense to it anymore. The livingness which come from the absolute is partly gone. It is above all nothing but pure knowledge, which would be knowing without intuition, as is the nullification of the opposites in contradiction. Speculative reflection is not the mechanical synthesis of two previously positions on intuition, reflection, and cognition. Only by reflecting those two positions into identity can the synthesis of absolute reflection be brought about. This is done by demonstrating that empirical consciousness presupposes itself in transcendental consciousness, has its truth in the objectivity of the thing in itself. As a result of such a mediation of the two opposed and contradictory positions of empiricism and transcendentalism, speculative or absolute reflection becomes, as Hippolyte notes, the a priori spontaneity that both presupposes and which one discovers in them. This is a priori synthesis is that of self-positing absolute that enlightens itself by its own light. Hegel's speculative reflection thus gathers into one what Kant had conceptualized under the title of the transcendental and formal unity of a perception, and the empirical consciousness made possible by the latter. Speculative reflection is the analysis sub specie aeterni, so to speak. That is, here in the perspective of the entirety of logical determination of the still reflective opposition of empiricism and transcendentalism. Hegel writes in the Difference, in order to grasp transcendental intuition in its purity, philosophical reflection must further abstract from this subjective aspect so that transcendental intuition, as the foundation of philosophy, may be neither subjective nor objective. For it, neither self-consciousness as opposed to matter, nor matter as opposed to self-consciousness, but pure transcendental intuition, absolute identity that is neither subjective nor objective. So the task of speculative philosophy is consequently to suspend the apparent opposition of transcendental and empirical consciousness. This suspension is achieved in the truly a priori synthesis of absolute reflection, which is a truly a priori spontaneity. Because it contains itself both the a priori as a purely formal identity and the very possibility of an a posteriority, which in it are no longer absolutely opposed. This true a priori spontaneity of absolute reflection also represents the overcoming of the absolute reflective opposition of subject and object. Empirical subjectivity as a subjectivity riveted to objects, as well as transcendental subjectivity as subjectivity is overcome in this true a priori, which coincides with the self-determination of the concept or notion in the exposition of the process of its logical unfolding. So what Hegel shows here, and as Derrida so clearly points out here at page 53 in the self-deconstruction or self-destruction of reflection, is that there is an unfolding of knowledge. And this reminds me a bit about Thea and Aletheia, Alethi, not forgotten. It is uncovering and covering going on at the very same time. That is the revealment of everything. That is the absolute reflection. And even though philosophical reflection and isolated reflection still though come into the picture, the absolute sort of, in a certain way, encompasses, but still lets the differences be differences. And that might be the very most important. And this is something that is ghastly, I would say, hard to achieve without understanding this. You will be locked, I would even say a deadlock of either or. And this either or strangles the text. It makes it less absolute. It makes it less true. It's diminishing it, and there is a nullification going on, a sort of undermining exactly what you yourself want to say or show or write, whatever you are intending. And I would also say this is the true ghost that haunts all texts today, or almost all. We got stuck in a polarity, and this polarity dissolves itself. Absolute reflection is the way out of this. But it is a complement in a way. It doesn't eradicate anything, because if it would only be philosophical reflection and nothing else. I think that's the best way of sum these pages 51, 52, 53. Sorry to read directly from the text, but it needs to be read directly and fresh. I do look at the text later on, and some new ideas always comes up, some new insights. But this is the very start, I'd say, because this is one of the most elevated texts ever written in a Western language. That I am quite sure of. Well, that concludes today's afternoon lecture. I say thank you very much, and let's end up with a view of this sunny, beautiful landscape. It is like a picture. And here we have Arios Fanurios. Newly painted as well. Say thank you very much, and until next, have a good time.